Hello, everyone. I am Mustansar Siam from Lahore, Pakistan, and Kevin Bloor has joined me from London, United Kingdom, to discuss regionalism, success of European Union, and Brexit. Kevin Bloor is a British author, a writer, and teacher. He is an MPhil in government from Manchester University and has written several books, including Understanding Global Politics. So my first question to you, Kevin Bloor, is basically that there is a debate regarding the relationship of regionalism with globalization. Some have opinion that regionalism actually challenges globalization, while other are of the view that it is built upon it. How do you view this complex relationship?
Sure. Well, I would say that regionalism and globalization are presented as a dichotomy very often, but to me, this seems very false. There is definitely a tendency within politics to frame political decisions on this basis. I mean, there's a lot of dichotomies within politics, but I think anyone who spends time researching these issues can see that this is somewhat helpful. Having said that, although it's a complex issue, I think there are some things we can observe. For me, I think regionalism presents both a challenge to globalization and complementary too. It's not deterministic, and I'll just try and expand on that if I may. Regionalism, it seeks to integrate states with an institutional framework. That's what it is. So the EU, of course, others increasingly like the African Union and many others too. There's, of course, different levels of integration. The EU is very integrated, NAFTA, obviously the new name for it, less so. But that doesn't mean to say it doesn't exist. We also need to be clear about how we should view state sovereignty here as well. Westphalia is still the touchstone because we live in a very Eurocentric, Western-centric way of looking at the world. However, some people say it's Westphalia, as in it has failed. So we need to be recognising that. Just on a final point, I would say regionalism creates institutions. It can create a momentum behind the process of globalisation. I think this is most notable in the case of those institutions that are, I would say, Western-centric. So NATO is a particularly clear illustration of that point. This also ties in neatly to another Western-centric view, institutional peace theory. However, institutions can also be consistent with the idea of state sovereignty. You know, the Arab League is a particularly good illustration of that point, and therefore doesn't really challenge the process of globalization at all. I'll say on a final point, regionalism also deals with the consequences. So the EU has had a more effective response to multinational companies who, for whatever reason, have been engaged in bad practices. Equally, it can enable it to encourage the process. And I would say the EU provides another salient illustration of that point.
Okay, my second question is basically about that. How does regionalism affect the national sovereignty of the state? Because it is widely considered that regionalism actually undermines the sovereignty of the state.
Yeah, now for me, regionalism is not inherently incompatible with national sovereignty. It is possible to pool sovereignty, and in the UK at least, this was a very, very important argument behind the Remain side in the 2016 referendum. So political figures from different sides of the spectrum said that European integration enhanced the ability of the United Kingdom and other member states too to get things done, both in terms of what we traditionally call high politics and low politics. Now, equally, there is an argument that sovereignty is inherently zero-sum, and this obviously relates to supranational institutions within the European Union, like the Commission. Personally, I think this is again too simplistic, and whenever you take a simplistic path, it takes you down the wrong route for me. Cooperation on a formal basis with some institutional structure enables states to deal with cross-border issues like sort of crime, terrorism, and the environment, and so on. And I think it's particularly telling that most countries have sought to work together to tackle those kind of threats. If you take the one of fundamentalist terrorism, for example, that seems entirely consistent with protecting sovereignty. Indeed, it's only by working together, by, let's say, sharing intel, for example, that you can firm up your borders. And this applies to all regions of the world, some more than others. Now, groups that seek to impose a fundamentalist view of Islam clearly thrive in states that are, I would say, fragile, weak, or failing in some way. Even states that traditionally seek to be quite protective of their sovereignty have shared, sort of worked together here, like the Peninsula Shield Force, the GCC kind of really springs to mind here. Frankly, borders are increasingly porous and they're subject to challenge from transnational forces. It seems to me the regionalism is therefore consistent with the sovereignty of the state. Indeed, the fact the EU has expanded on several occasions gives weight to the point as to the fact that it seems to be expanding even more. I'd also say that observation with NATO and, of course, the African Union. Of course, every member of Africa, the African continent, is a member with the exception of Morocco due to a border dispute. So for me, I think that is persuasive enough, I would have to say.
Okay. My third question is basically about European Union, as you have already mentioned that there are some certain factors which make it more successful. Can you elaborate it that why EU is considered as a great success in terms of economic pragmatism, standardizing markets, enlarging economies of the scale, and making traffic free of persons, goods, and ideas? In your view, what actually makes EU more successful?
I would say the success of the EU is derived from its focused on tangible benefits. I would say that the heyday of European integration was the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, when quite honestly, the ambitions of the organisation were focused quite laser-like, I would say, on tangible benefits, and they tended to be on a practical economic basis. Now, this, of course, is underpinned by the conceptual framework of neo-functionalism and the concept, which I think is a rather interesting one, of spillover. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it provided a blueprint for further European integration. And I would also say that the EU has always been successful when it has been fundamentally pragmatic. So it's been at its most successful when it's focused on winning over, say, the hearts and minds of its citizens. However, what makes it less successful is when there's the tendency amongst its major players to overreach. Now, as with all institutions, if you look at empires, there's always the problem of the capability expectations gap. I came of age politically during the 1990s, and what was very clear is when we were faced with the Yugoslav wars, we being Europeans, it was a European problem, required a European solution, and that was exposed as ridiculously empty rhetoric. And it really, we needed the Americans to come and help us. Yes, exactly. So whilst the organisation is sui generis, it is unique in many ways. It shouldn't be no surprise that it's the subject of the same laws of politics as any major institution. And I think a great book here is The Rise and Fall of Great Powers by Paul Kennedy. Now, those who enact European integration should learn from history and say there is a tendency to let rhetoric overtake reality. My final point on this question is the observation concerning Greece. Now, the Greek economy was allowed into the Eurozone, the convergence criteria, because the European institutions said we're going to count the informal economy, and that was proved to be an absolute disaster. And that's a classic example of rhetoric overtaking reality. I think the EU has ruled the day ever since, quite frankly.
Exactly. It is believed that European history of cooperation over centuries and common enemy factor in the form of Soviet Union also played a very significant role in the regional development. What is your take on that?
I completely agree with this observation. Cooperation requires a binding force of some description, and there's nothing more effective than, frankly, the existence of an enemy, however one defines it. It has the very clear advantage it concentrates minds, forges a common voice, and quite honestly, gets things done. Although Europe does speak, when it speaks with something of a whisper, and has yet to answer Henry Kissinger's wonderfully famous jab, who do I call if I want to speak to Europe? It has made significant strides in this area, and it really has integrated even in what we might call high politics. The very existence of a common foreign and security policy and all the kind of acronyms that have been born since then is, I think, testimony to the desire amongst member states to actually stand against a shared enemy. I don't think it's any coincidence that integration with this military and defence dimension has gained traction when it's been under the shadow of a shared threat. So during the Cold War, during the early 70s, for example, the EU established European political cooperation. Now, this is a time when there were tensions, particularly between the US and the Soviets. This was just before the détente, the later period. More recently, PESCO is a good example. That came to effect 3 years after the Russian annexation of Crimea. And again, I think it does focus minds. And on a final note, I think we can gain a huge amount of insight here from other subjects. I'm a great fan of the amity complex. I don't know if you know that. It's from Sir Arthur Keith. He examined human evolution and he identified the idea of tribalism. Now, I think this is very rooted within human nature. I take a rather pessimistic, almost realist view here. I think it's incredibly easy a group of people to other another group that don't share the same characteristics. You can see this all over the world. You know, it does apply to Pakistan, as I'm sure you would acknowledge. It equally applies to Europe, perhaps even more so, and so on. It certainly applies. I think also another great experiment is the Robbers Cave experiment in psychology. I also think there's insights with the famous Milgram experiment in psychology, and also the Stanford Prison experiment as well. So I think we can learn from other social sciences here. So in essence, I completely agree with that particular observation, completely.
Okay. In your view, what can be the biggest challenges for EU in coming 2 decades?
Yes, this is a very good question. I would anticipate the European Union faces 4 main challenges: Russia, China, demography, and the most important one of all is climate change. Now, I'll start with Russia. I think that's likely to dominate the immediacy. Russia's a military power, it's a nuclear power, it's an energy superpower, which I think is important. It's also one of the leading proponents of cyber warfare. So Russia seems to me the most important challenge in the immediacy, the most immediate challenge rather. And I think it's welcoming to know the EU has worked together to arm Ukraine, for example, and even Germany has broken its constitutional convention in regards to that. Second one is China. I think the threat of China is a bit more long-term, and given its political, military, economic power. I would say this is in the context of the global balance of power. I would say it's shifting very slowly, not dramatically, very slowly, towards the east. The West, in a broad sense, seems to be in decline. I think America pulling out of Afghanistan is one salient illustration at that point. Biden himself was elected on a mandate to end wars, not start them. And I think America, has been going down this route, actually, going back to the Obama administration, actually, and also in case of Trump. Trump was very bellicose and obviously had a very interesting way of putting things over. But the reality of his administration was quite isolationist, really. He was not looking to start fights by any means, despite the rhetoric that he used. Now, China's membership of the G20, which is going to become increasingly significant as time goes on, I am certain of that. Also, the BRICS, there's talk there about an alternative currency to the dollar, rather interestingly, alongside the OBOR, the One Belt, the Belt Road Initiative. This is indicative of China's ambitions. So I think it's pretty clear ambitions. They've also moved away from what might be called quiet diplomacy, based on that very popular Chinese game of Go, whereby the idea is to really kind of lull your opponent into conceding an advantage or a disadvantage from his perspective, towards a more belligerent approach. Xi Jinping, for me, seems to be the most powerful Chinese figure since surely Chairman Mao, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Demography is also an interesting one here. Now, let me just be clear what I mean here. I mean the influx of refugees. And I think for a lot of countries, this is difficult to accommodate. This isn't just a European phenomenon by any means. I think it's particularly difficult when cultural values and practices find it problematic to assimilate in some way. Members of the EU are not unique, and I'm a great believer here in the Clash of Civilizations argument of Samuel Huntington. I think this is very applicable here. I would also say Russia has every incentive to stir things up and create the kind of fears. So, for example, it has every incentive to keep the Syrian situation the way it is, because refugees will flee from Syria to other countries, and when they go into European Union countries, then sort of public anxiety is exacerbated. I'm reminded of Churchill's quote here. I'm just going to quote it in full. "I cannot forecast you the actions of Russia. It's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is the key. The key is Russian national interest." And I think it is in Russia's national interest here to kind of stoke up these kind of fears. But climate change, however, is the most important. It's also called a climate emergency. I think that's probably a better term, actually. And terminology is important because it involves us all. The most immediate threat is surely to low-lying areas like the Netherlands, but frankly, we're all at risk. Now, on a final note, though, the EU has been remarkably resilient. It has faced challenges throughout its history. It's even faced a prolonged period of Eurosclerosis, particularly in the 1970s. And it's always come back time and time again with more integration, or possibly even more successful integration. It's also shown a capacity to work together. So, frankly, we should not be fatalistic when it comes to these 4 main challenges.
Okay, thank you. There is another criticism on the functioning of EU, and some call it as a bureaucratic nightmare due to its over-institutionalization and complicated rules. How would you place this argument?
Yeah. Now, this is a difficult one to answer because I've no practical experience of dealing with the EU in any way, in terms of a business or in terms of academia. One thing that really jumps out, though, is the sheer weight of the acquis communautaire. It has gone up and up and up, and the ever-increasing number of laws and directives seems indicative to me that Europe is very good at creating paperwork. In fact, one thing I've noticed within teaching is that paperwork tends to create more paperwork. That tends to be always the case. So I don't know if you can relate to that yourself. Of course, there'd be less need for this if member states actually were more cooperative and accommodating on the process of harmonisation. They've signed up to harmonisation, and frankly, all they have to do is implement it via national laws, but some seem reluctant to do that. There's also a high number of institutions, and it does add weight to this claim that the organisation is overtly overcomplicated. Whenever you explain to students, for example, you might show it on a flowchart. It doesn't invite simplicity. It's not there to persuade hearts or minds at all. If one thing really jumps out in statistic and captures the problem, it's the existence of 5 presidents. We have a Commission, European Council, Parliament, the Council of the EU, and European Central Bank. Now, any organisation that has 5 presidents is almost kind of inviting ridicule. Changing the name of EU institutions as well, which has a predilection to do so, also complicates matters. At the very least, the optics of that are not particularly good. Now, there's one thing I'd like to identify here, it's the wording of the Rome Treaty. It is very clearly an ever closer union, and I think that's in itself a problem. I'm going to make a contrast here with the American one of an ever perfect union. Now, the beauty of the American system is it enables the politics of compromise, as Aristotle famously said. It enables the the United States, to perhaps give more powers to Washington when that's appropriate, but also row back those powers and give them all to the states based on the 10th Amendments when that's appropriate too. The United States has gone through a great many changes in terms of how it operates its federalist structure. So there's great scope to find the right balance, whatever's consistent. Now, that's always controversial, but at least they can find a balance. The problem with the European Union is there's an ideological rigidity towards it. It does say, right, the integration is going to be deeper, end of discussion. Ever closer union is clearly a recipe for deeper integration, and that's it. And that, of course, was too deep for a great number of the British population when they had the plebiscite 6 years ago. So I think, and it's also impossible to reverse, so there's something to highlight there. If there is a bureaucratic nightmare or a problem of bureaucracy, a lot of it has to do with that phrase, those 4 words, an ever closer union.
Okay. Brexit is considered as one of the important developments in the history of Europe, and the view about Brexit is also divided. How do you view this incident which has happened in European integration while posing some serious challenges for EU as a regional organizations? What benefits do you see for British after Brexit?
None whatsoever. I think the impact of Brexit, yes, I have to be blunt here. I think the impact of Brexit has been very damaging. I'll give you one example, supply chains. The United Kingdom is a relatively wealthy economy. It's clearly a very developed one, a great many actors. I'm not here to wave the flag for Britain. I'm not going to do that. But the point is this. The labour market is now in this country in a state of disequilibrium. There are more job vacancies than the number of people unemployed. And that's the very first time that's occurred in British history. Now, this alone suggests that people are either unwilling to do certain jobs that, it has to be said, a lot of migrants were doing from the EU and other countries, admittedly, or they don't have the skills to do it, like a doctor or a nurse, for example. Now, the economy has shrunk. I mean, that's statistically true due to the impact of the global situation with the pandemic and so on. This is true of virtually all economies, I think, even possibly all. But it has been more severe in the UK than other comparable countries if we compare ourselves to the EU or perhaps members of the G7, which seems the most obvious comparison. Now, Brexit hasn't been bad for everyone. It's been wonderful for a certain group within the Conservative Party. We have the most populist government we've ever had, and really the most populist our political culture in Britain would ever really allow for. Brexit has allowed Boris Johnson and courtiers around him, the ERG, the European Research Group, to present the 2019 election, last one we had in this country, as the people versus the powerful, or the people versus the elite. Now, this tactics have been attempted in other countries, like the US is a good example of that, and many other illustrations in the world too, sort of Hungary, Poland, etc. And it does in this world seem to provide a pathway towards power. There's no doubt, I mean, wherever my own personal views, the tactics have been wonderfully successful. It did win over what we call in this country red wall areas, which are traditionally Labour, the heartlands of the North and the Midlands. and a great many of them did vote Conservative for the first time in 2019. Now, Brexit has moved the Overton window towards a populist manner, which the Prime Minister feels his brand will allow him to ignore personal accountability for what he did during the pandemic, for example, how many parties, and ignore the Supreme Court that we have in this country, and for the UK to break international law, which increasingly it seems to be doing, which is terrible. I think most British people have a sense of, they pride themselves on a sense of fair play. Now, that could easily be criticised. I have to hold my hands up there. But that kind of sense has been undermined by this very populist leader in government. Boris himself, interesting enough, has really just put his ego first and has taken the path, the quickest way towards number 10 Downing Street. He's been isolated and inoculated from the concerns of ordinary people. And it's no surprise we've ended up in this situation. For me, it allows him to perform, Brexit allows him to perform this act, really, and he is a good actor, I have to acknowledge that, of an essentially posh person voicing the things, what he thinks are the prejudgments of ordinary people. And he's done that act quite well. Remains to be seen whether he'll stay in power, but I think Brexit has enabled him to do that.
Okay. Some people have opinion about Brexit that it was actually engineered because EU was posing some serious challenges to the global superstructure.
Yeah.
What is your take on that?
Yeah. Well, if this is a covert reference to the Russian Federation, then there probably is some veracity to this claim. At the very least, it makes sense for Moscow to destabilize the West. And the Putin regime certainly has the skills, the mindset, you could say, and the capacity to do this. We do live in a culture in which news, and I have to use news in inverted commas there, is increasingly consumed online, which is the perfect climate for fake news and the influence of outsiders. I think we also have to point fingers here at the Chinese. So I think really the Brexit was in part shaped by sort of covert damaging figures. There were two seismic events in 2016, Trump and Brexit, and they were shaped to a degree by outside forces. And again, we have to look to Russia and China particularly here. This is part of a broader power play within global politics. And I think it's shaped in a wider sense by the force of democracy, albeit flawed, with authoritarianism. Now, this is sometimes called the Washington consensus versus what the journalist Joshua Roma called the Beijing consensus. I think in a very, very broad sense, that's possibly true. I think we are moving, again, rather slowly, admittedly, towards a new thaw in relation between the major powers. And Brexit has to be put into that context, I think. Now, if you do accept this binary distinction, the EU is definitely part of the West, of course, and authoritarian regimes like Russia have every reason to undermine an organisation, along with things like NATO, because NATO and the UN have encroached on Russia's sphere of influence. So the EU thereby, by definition, undermines the relative power of Russia. So Russia has every incentive to punch back, if you like, and try and influence something like Brexit. So the EU has become a force in global governance. That's no doubt the case. It's part of the Middle East Quartet, the G7, the G20. It also continues to expand its membership and its presence via the neighbourhood policy. And frankly, Russia has little or no common ground with the organisation. So it must view the EU in negative terms. So it has every incentive to do so. And I have no doubt Putin's regime had something to do with it.
Okay. What possible lessons other regional organizations, I mean EU, SAARC, NAFTA, and ASEAN, can learn from the success of EU, keeping into the view that other regions do not have similar political dynamics, history of empire building and conflicts and colonialism?
Sure. I think the EU is often called a blueprint for regional organisations, but this in itself is a theme I've returned to earlier, Western or Eurocentric understanding of the world. It also it derives from a mindset of weird, which is increasingly used, which is Western educated, industrialised, rich democracy, which is effectively the norm through which we tend to view global politics. So anything outside of that is viewed as abnormal. Whether or not that's true or not is very debatable. It also provides a prism through which we view politics. And I think I sometimes note that rather humorously, that's only a couple of letters away from the word prison. I'm a great student here of Thomas Kuhn's insight into paradigms. I think he has a lot of insights there. Now, the lessons apply to both successes and the failures. I think the main success of the EU is in terms of economics. The EU facilitated trade. Until relatively recently, it was the biggest single market in the world, and facilitating trade seems to be inherently a good thing. I think in a very broad sense, the commercial peace theory of liberals is, I think, a relatively strong one. at the very least, trade tends to raise standards. And I think that was also shown by the concept of comparative advantage from the economist David Ricardo, for example. I don't think we need to be too sniffy about, sort of ignoring what other social sciences, a point I made earlier with psychology. I'd also like to spotlight the African Union here, because I think it's a fascinating case study. Now, virtually all members of the African Union were colonised at some point by a European country. And you would think, not unreasonably, that countries like that, after having fought for independence, sometimes in a very bloody and protracted nature, they'd have every reason to just ignore anything the EU did and not do anything that their former colonialists had done. However, the African Union has adopted a very similar approach. It has a legislature, an executive, a judiciary. It's also moved towards a single currency in the foreseeable future. Let's see how that goes. But I mean, that you have to say that is very much following the blueprint of the EU. You can't really say that's a blueprint of anywhere else. Now, equally, main organisations do not follow the EU. Some were around before, the Arab League's a good example of that. And political dynamics, as you allude to, do matter a great deal. A good example here, I think, is the ASEAN way. Now, the ASEAN way is very much about quiet diplomacy. We don't argue in public. We try and keep our differences private and so on. And I think it has to be done in the context of political culture within that particular part of the world. Circumstances could never be transplanted to any part of the world. And I wouldn't be in favour of that. In fact, I think to do so would be surely a form of neo-colonialism, albeit from organisation rather than countries themselves. So I think that would be my answer to that question, Mustansar.
Okay, thank you so much, Kevin Bloor.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on for this short interview. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, and I hope everything goes well.